Rain poured relentlessly from a sky so heavy it seemed intent on smothering the earth. Kaelor stumbled forward, their body weakened by days of wandering, every step dragging them closer to collapse. The forest loomed around them, a dark and unfamiliar tangle of shapes that whispered danger in every rustling leaf and snapping twig. Water streamed down their face, soaking through their tattered cloak and chilling them to the bone. Their lungs burned with every shallow breath and their vision blurred, but they couldn't stop. Stopping meant death. Kaelor's kind were not made for this. The Theron had evolved on a world of gentle climates, where the air was warm and the ground was soft underfoot. Their bodies, lean and fragile, were not suited to the brutal elements of this world. The cold cut through them like shards of glass, each gust of wind stealing what little strength they had left. Still, they pressed on, their luminous silver eyes scanning the gloom for any sign of shelter. The first light appeared faintly through the trees, a flicker of warmth that seemed almost unreal after the relentless dark. Kaelor blinked, uncertain if their failing senses were playing tricks on them. But as they drew closer, the light grew steadier, resolving into the soft glow of a window. A home. Humans. Kaelor hesitated at the edge of the clearing, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The humans here were not like the ones they had encountered before. These humans were wary, territorial, and quick to defend what was theirs. Approach was to risk rejection, or worse. But Kaelor had no choice. The cold was a predator circling ever closer, and they were too weak to run anymore. Their legs gave out just as they reached the edge of the small farmhouse. The ground was unforgiving, its icy touch seeping through their cloak as they collapsed against the wooden door. Summoning the last remnants of their strength, Kaelor raised a trembling hand and knocked. 3 faint, uneven taps that barely made a sound. The door creaked open moments later, light spilling out into the night and casting Kaelor in sharp relief. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his features hardened by years of labor and caution. In his hand he held a rusted axe, the blade gleaming faintly in the firelight. "Who's there?" the man demanded, his voice rough but steady. Kaelor tried to speak, but their throat was too dry, their body too weak. Instead, they raised their head, meeting the man's sharp blue gaze with their own. The glow of Kaelor's eyes, unnatural and otherworldly, made the man's grip on the axe tighten. "Norvin, who is it?" A woman's voice called from inside, soft but laced with concern. Moments later, she appeared at the man's side, her face illuminated by the flickering light of a candle. She was younger than the man, her features kind but wary as she took in the figure crumpled at their doorstep. "It's someone," Norvin muttered, his brow furrowing. "Help," Kaelor managed to rasp, their voice barely audible. "Please." The woman's expression softened and she placed a hand on Norvin's arm. "They're hurt," she said. "We can't just leave them out here." "We don't know what they are," Norvin countered, though his voice lacked conviction. "And we don't know what'll happen if we don't help," the woman replied firmly. Without waiting for his response, she crouched down beside Kaelor, her movements cautious but determined. "Can you stand?" she asked gently. Kaelor shook, their head. "Too weak," they whispered. The woman exchanged a glance with Norvin, who sighed heavily. "Fine," he muttered. "But if they try anything—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of his words hung in the air as he stepped aside, allowing the woman to guide Kaelor inside. The warmth of the fire was almost overwhelming, the sudden contrast making Kaelor shiver uncontrollably as they were helped onto a worn but sturdy cot in the corner of the room. The woman, Alira, Kaelor learned, quickly wrapped them in blankets, her hands gentle but efficient as she worked. Norvin remained by the door, his axe still in hand, his eyes never leaving Kaelor. "You'd better start explaining," he said, after a long silence. Kaelor looked up at him, their vision still blurred, their body trembling from the cold. I mean no harm," they said slowly, their voice faint but steady. "I am lost. My ship, It is gone. I am alone. Norvin's eyes narrowed. Ship. Alira shot him a look. They're in no condition to explain anything right now, she said. Turning back to Kalor, she added softly, Rest. We'll talk later. Kalor nodded weakly, their bodies sinking further into the blankets. The warmth was beginning to seep into their frozen limbs, but the exhaustion was too great. Their eyes fluttered shut, and the world faded to black. When Kalor awoke, the storm had subsided, leaving behind an eerie silence. The fire still crackled in the hearth, its light casting long shadows across the room. Alira sat nearby, mending a tear in a simple woolen tunic. Norvin was nowhere to be seen. You're awake, Alira said, her voice soft, but alert. Kalor nodded, their movements slow and deliberate. Thank you, they said after a moment, their voice still faint but stronger than before. You're lucky we found you, Alira replied, her tone matter-of-fact. Another hour out there and you might not have made it. Kalor's gaze dropped to their hands, the pale skin marred by cuts and bruises. Why did you help me? They asked, their voice tinged with curiosity. Alira paused, her needle hovering above the fabric. Because it was the right thing to do, she said simply. Kalor looked up at her, their luminous eyes searching hers. Not all would agree. Alira's expression softened and she set her sewing aside. Maybe not, she admitted. But you're here now, and we'll figure out what to do next. At that moment, Norvin returned, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. He carried a bundle of firewood, which he deposited near the hearth, before turning his attention to Kalor. You've got a lot of explaining to do, he said bluntly, his tone sharp but not hostile. Who are you? And what are you doing here? Kalor hesitated, their mind racing to find the right words. I am called Kalor, they began slowly. I come from a world far from this one. My people. We were travelers, explorers. But our ship was damaged. We were forced to flee. And you ended up here, Norvin said, his skepticism clear. Kalor nodded. Yes, but this world, it is harsh. I was not prepared for it. You're not the only one, Norvin muttered, his gaze lingering on Kalor's glowing eyes. Alira placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. They're not a threat, Norvin, she said quietly. We don't know that, he replied, though his tone lacked the conviction it had held before. I owe you my life, Kalor said, their voice steady despite the weight of the admission. And I will do whatever it takes to repay that debt. I ask only for shelter, until I am strong enough to survive on my own. Norvin's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he considered their words. We don't have much to spare, he said finally. But for now, you can stay. Thank you, Kalor said, their voice filled with quiet gratitude. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, an uneasy peace settled over the small home. For Kalor, it was the first glimmer of hope they had felt in what seemed like an eternity. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. They were no longer entirely alone. Kalor spent the next few days confined to the small farmhouse, regaining their strength under the watchful eyes of Norvin and Alira. The warmth of the fire, the steady rhythm of life in the house, and the rare gift of safety allowed Kalor's body to heal. Yet the unease in Norvin's sharp gaze remained a constant reminder that trust was not easily won. Alira, in contrast, was softer, her kindness an anchor in the unfamiliar storm of Kalor's situation. She brought food, simple broths, bread, and occasionally bits of salted meat, encouraging them to eat, though Kalor's alien physiology required less sustenance than a human's. You hardly eat, she remarked one evening, sitting across from Kalor as they stared at the bowl in their hands. My body requires little, Kalor explained, their voice quiet but clear. Energy comes from the sun primarily. Food is secondary. Alira tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. The sun? Kalor nodded. On my world, it was bright and warm. We absorbed its energy. Here, the sun is weaker. It is different. Alira studied them for a moment, her gaze softening. That sounds beautiful. Your world, I mean. A shadow passed over Kalor's face, their luminous eyes lowering to the fire. It was, they murmured. But it is gone now. Consumed by the void. Alira's heart ached at the sorrow in Kalor's voice, the weight of loss that seemed to seep from every word. She reached out hesitantly, placing a hand on their arm. I'm sorry, she said softly. Kalor looked up at her, their gaze filled with a quiet gratitude. You are kind, they said. More than most. Before Alira could respond, the door creaked open, and Norvin entered, his boots tracking mud across the wooden floor. He carried a bundle of wild roots and herbs, the day's meager harvest from the forest. What are you two talking about? He asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp as they flicked between them. Kalor was telling me about their world, Alira said. Norvin grunted, setting the bundle down on the table. Their world doesn't matter. What matters is figuring out what they'll do next. Kalor straightened slightly, meeting Norvin's gaze. I told you. I will not stay longer than necessary. Once I am strong enough, I will leave. And go where? Norvin asked, crossing his arms. You don't know this land. You don't know how to survive out there. I will learn, Kalor said simply. Norvin shook his head. Learning won't save you from the wolves, or the cold, or the people who won't hesitate to kill someone who looks different. The truth in his words struck Kalor like a blow, but they held their ground. Then what do you suggest? Norvin hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced at Alira. For now you stay, he said finally, but you pull your weight. Help where you can. Kalor nodded. I will do whatever you ask. The following days were a strange but steady rhythm of adjustment. Norvin and Alira worked tirelessly to keep the small farm running, and true to their word, Kalor helped in whatever ways they could. Their strength, though still returning, proved useful for tasks that required endurance. They carried firewood, tended to the small garden, and even helped patch the roof, their dexterous hands making quick work of the repairs. Norvin remained guarded, his watchful eyes always tracking Kalor's movements, but there were moments when his stern exterior softened. One afternoon, as they worked side by side repairing a broken fence, Norvin glanced at Kalor and said gruffly, You're not as useless as I thought you'd be. Kalor turned to him, their expression unreadable. I have survived much. I am not weak. Norvin grunted in response, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement in his gaze. Alira, meanwhile, had grown more comfortable with Kalor's presence. She often asked questions, her curiosity insatiable. What does your world's sky look like? She asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Kalor hesitated, their gaze distant. It was alive, they said slowly. Colors danced across it, shifting like waves. It was never still, always moving, always beautiful. Alira smiled, her eyes lighting up at the description. It sounds like a dream. It was, Kalor said, their voice tinged with sorrow. And now it is gone. The weight of their words hung in the air, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. One night, as the three of them sat together in the small living space, Norvin finally voiced the question that had been lingering in the back of his mind. What happens if your people come looking for you? He asked, his tone cautious but direct. Kalor looked up from the mug of herbal tea Alira had given them, their luminous eyes reflecting the firelight. They will not, they said simply. Why not? Norvin pressed. Kalor hesitated, their hands tightening around the mug. Because I am the only one left. The rest, they are gone, lost to the void. The weight of the confession settled heavily in the room, a silence stretching between them. Even Norvin, who was rarely at a loss for words, seemed unsure of what to say. I'm sorry, Alira said finally, her voice soft. Kalor nodded, their expression unreadable. It is the way of things, they said. But I will endure. I always endure. Despite the tension that lingered, a tentative sense of companionship began to form. Kaylor's presence, though unusual, was no longer a source of constant suspicion. They had proven their willingness to work, their quiet resilience earning a measure of respect from Norvin and a deepening connection with Alira. But the peace was fragile, like the thin layer of frost that covered the ground each morning. The world beyond the small farmhouse was harsh and unyielding, and Kaylor knew it was only a matter of time before the storm that had driven them to this place found them again. For now, though, they allowed themselves a rare moment of hope. As they sat by the fire listening to the quiet hum of Alira's song and the steady rhythm of Norvin sharpening his blade, Kaylor felt, for the first time in a long time, that they were not entirely alone. As the days stretched into weeks, the buar rhythm of life at the farmhouse became strangely comforting. The cold outside had grown sharper, biting through the mornings and frosting the windows in intricate patterns. But inside, the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship of Alira and Norvin gave Kaylor a feeling they hadn't known in years. Safety. Still, Kaylor was mindful not to overstep. They were careful to stay out of Norvin's way when he worked, and they watched Alira closely, picking up on her routines and assisting wherever they could. When Alira kneaded dough for bread, Kaylor fetched the water. When Norvin split logs for the fire, Kaylor stacked them neatly. These small gestures seemed to ease some of the tension that lingered between them, though Norvin still watched them with wary eyes. One particularly cold morning, Kaylor stood outside, their silver eyes turned toward the sky. The sun struggled to break through the thick gray clouds, its weak light barely reaching the frozen ground. Kaylor closed their eyes and tilted their head upward, trying to absorb what little warmth it offered. "You'll freeze out here," Alira's voice called from the doorway. Kaylor opened their eyes and turned to her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of their lips. "The cold cannot harm me as it does you," they said. "Still, it's not exactly pleasant," Alira replied, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped outside. "What were you doing?" "Remembering," Kaylor said softly, their gaze drifting back to the sky. "The sun here is different, fainter. It reminds me of what was lost." Alira stepped closer, her brow furrowing. "Do you ever wish you hadn't survived?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Kaylor turned to her, their luminous eyes meeting hers. "At times," they admitted. "Survival can be a heavy burden, but it is also a gift, and gifts must be honored." Alira nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "You're stronger than most people I know," she said after a moment. Kaylor's gaze softened. "Strength is not always a choice," they said. "Sometimes it is the only path forward." Before Alira could respond, Norvin's voice called from inside the house. "Alira, if you're done chatting, we've got work to do." Alira rolled her eyes but smiled. "He's not wrong," she said. "Come on, we're making stew tonight, and I could use an extra set of hands." Kaylor followed her inside, the brief moment of reflection giving way to the comforting routine of the day. As winter deepened, the snow arrived, blanketing the world in white. Kaylor marveled at it, the way it muted the sounds of the forest and shimmered under the pale moonlight. To them it was both beautiful and alien, a reminder of how far they were from the warmth of their homeworld. One evening, as the three of them sat around the fire, Alira broached a topic that had lingered unspoken for too long. "Kaylor," she began, her voice hesitant but steady, "what happens if someone else finds you? Someone who isn't kind?" Kaylor's expression darkened, their gaze dropping to their hands. "It has happened before," they said quietly. "What did you do?" Norvin asked, his voice sharp but curious. Kaylor hesitated, their fingers tightening around the mug they held. "I did what I had to do," they said finally. "To survive." The weight of their words hung in the air, unspoken questions swirling between them. Norvin's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I won't," Let that happen here, Alira said suddenly, her voice firm. You're safe with us. Kaylor looked up at her, their luminous eyes filled with quiet gratitude. Thank you, they said, their voice barely above a whisper. Norvin sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. You're putting a lot of faith in someone we barely know, he muttered. Sometimes faith is all we have, Alira replied, her tone unwavering. Norvin shook his head but didn't argue further. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face. Kaylor watched them both, a strange warmth stirring in their chest. For the first time in a long time, they felt something more than survival. They felt the faint stirrings of belonging, but the peace was not to last. It began with distant howls echoing through the forest, a sound that sent shivers down Kaylor's spine. Norvin stood at the window, his grip tightening on the axe he had taken, to keeping close at all times. Wolves, he said grimly. A big pack by the sound of it. They're getting closer, Alira said, her voice laced with worry. Kaylor stood beside them, their silver eyes scanning the darkened trees. I can help, they said, their voice steady. How? Norvin asked, his tone skeptical. I am stronger now, Kaylor replied, and I am not afraid. Norvin hesitated, his gaze searching Kaylor's face for any sign of deception. Finally, he nodded. All right, but you stay close, and if things go bad, you get Alira and run. Understand? Kaylor nodded. I will protect her, they said. The next few hours passed in tense silence, the three of them keeping watch as the howls grew louder. When the first shadowy shapes emerged from the tree line, Kaylor felt their pulse quicken. The wolves were massive, their eyes gleaming with hunger and their teeth bared in feral snarls. Norvin gripped his axe tightly, his stance firm. Alira stood behind him, her hands trembling but her expression resolute. Kaylor stepped forward, their glowing eyes locking onto the lead wolf. Leave, they said, their voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that seemed to ripple through the air. The wolf hesitated, its head tilting as it regarded Kaylor. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a low growl, the wolf lunged. Kaylor moved faster than either Norvin or Alira had ever seen, their body a blur as they intercepted the wolf mid-leap. The impact sent them both sprawling, into the snow. But Kaylor was on their feet in an instant, their movements fluid and precise. The battle was fierce and chaotic, the air filled with snarls and shouts. But Kaylor fought with a strength and determination that left Norvin and Alira staring in awe. When the last of the wolves finally retreated, dragging their wounded leader back into the forest, Kaylor stood in the snow, their chest heaving and their body battered but unbroken. Norvin approached them cautiously, his axe still in hand. You're something else, he said, his voice a mix of awe and wariness. Kaylor turned to him, their silver eyes glowing softly in the moonlight. I told you, they said quietly. I will protect those who shelter me. Alira stepped forward, her gaze filled with gratitude. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. Kaylor nodded, their expression softening. You have given me much, they said. This was the least I could do. As they returned to the warmth of the farmhouse, the bond between them felt stronger than ever. And though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. They would face it together. The winter dragged on, but something had shifted in the small farmhouse. The bond between Kaylor, Alira, and Norvin had grown stronger, forged in the fires of survival and trust. The memory of the wolf attack lingered, not as a haunting specter, but as a testament to their unity. For the first time, the three of them began to see each other not as strangers, but as a makeshift family, bound by circumstance. Kaylor, who had once been an alien figure in the corner of the room, was now woven into the daily fabric of their lives. Their strength became a vital part of the farm's survival. They hauled water, cleared paths through the snow, and even repaired a section of the barn that had collapsed under the weight of ice. But it was their quiet presence, their willingness to listen and share stories of a lost world that truly cemented their place in Alira and Norvin's hearts. One evening, As a storm howled outside, the three of them gathered around the hearth. Alira hummed softly while mending a torn coat, her needle moving deftly through the fabric. Norvin polished his axe with methodical care, his movements steady and deliberate. Kaelor sat cross-legged near the fire, their silver eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Tell us about your people," Alira said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Kaelor hesitated, their gaze flickering to Norvin, who gave a small nod of approval. "My people were different," Kaelor began, their voice soft but clear. "We lived in harmony with our world. Everything was connected, our lives, the land, even the stars above. There was no separation, no walls." "That sounds like a dream," Alira said, her eyes wide with wonder. "It was," Kaelor replied, a faint smile playing on their lips. "But even dreams can end." The room fell silent, the weight of Kaelor's words settling over them. Norvin cleared his throat, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You've been through hell, Kaelor, but you're still here. That means something." Kaelor looked at him, their expression unreadable. "Perhaps," they said, "but survival is not the same as living." As the weeks passed, the harshness of winter began to ease. The snow melted into muddy streams and the first hints of green emerged from the thawing earth. Alira was the first to notice the change, her excitement infectious as she pointed out the budding trees and the return of birdsong. "It's like the world's waking up," she said one morning, her face lit with a rare smile. Kaelor nodded, their gaze sweeping over the landscape. "Your world has a resilience I admire," they said. Norvin snorted, adjusting the strap on his pack. "Resilience doesn't come easy. You've got to fight for it." "And you have fought well," Kaelor said, their tone sincere. Norvin glanced at them, his expression softening. "We all have." But as spring bloomed around them, so too did the lingering question of Kaelor's future. The snow may have melted, but the world beyond the farm remained as uncertain as ever. Kaelor could not stay forever, and they knew it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kaelor stood outside, their gaze fixed on the darkening sky. Alira joined them, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders to ward off the evening chill. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Kaelor turned to her, their silver eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resolve. "I must," they said. "I cannot remain here forever. My presence puts you and Norvin at risk." Alira shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You've done nothing but help us, Kaelor. You don't have to go." Kaelor reached out, their hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Your kindness has given me more than I could have hoped for," they said. "But the world is not as kind. If others discover me here, they will not show mercy." Alira bit her lip, her hands clenching the edges of her shawl. "You don't have to face it alone," she said. "I do," Kaelor replied, their voice soft but firm. "It is my burden to bear." The next morning, Kaelor prepared to leave. They packed the few belongings they had accumulated, a warm cloak Alira had sewn for them, a small blade Norvin had given them for protection, and a pouch of dried food. Alira watched silently, her heart heavy with the weight of their departure. Norvin stood by the door, his expression stoic but his grip on the doorframe betraying his tension. "Where will you go?" Norvin asked, breaking the silence. "Far from here," Kaelor replied. "Somewhere I will not bring trouble to your home." "You're not trouble," Alira said, her voice trembling. Kaelor turned to her, their expression softening. "You have given me something I thought I would never feel again," they said. "A sense of belonging. I will carry that with me. Always." Norvin stepped forward, holding out a small bundle. "Take this," he said gruffly. "It's not much, but it'll help." Kaelor accepted the bundle, their luminous eyes meeting Norvin's. "Thank you," they said. Norvin nodded, his jaw tightening. "Take care of yourself out there." "I will," Kaelor promised. As Kaelor stepped out into the early morning light, Alira followed them to the edge of the farm. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the waking world filling the air. "I wish things were different," Alira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "So do I," Kaylor replied. Before they could stop themselves, Alira reached out and hugged Kaylor tightly. For a moment, Kaylor stiffened, unaccustomed to the human gesture. But then they relaxed, their arms wrapping gently around her. "Goodbye, Alira," Kaylor said softly. "Goodbye, Kaylor," she whispered. Kaylor left the farm that day, their footsteps fading into the distance. Alira and Norvin watched until they were out of sight, their hearts heavy with the loss of their strange but cherished companion. But even as they returned to the quiet rhythm of life on the farm, they carried with them the memory of Kaylor, the alien who had become family, the stranger who had taught them the power of resilience, kindness, and trust. And somewhere out there, beneath a sky that was not their own, Kaylor walked with the hope that they would one day find a place where they could truly belong. For now they carried the warmth of Alira and Norvin's kindness in their heart, a light to guide them through the darkness of the unknown.